Hi, and welcome back to Let's Talk Adoption. I'm Heather. I have Kim here with me, and today's episode actually started with something kind of funny. I was looking at different search terms people use online when they're trying to learn about adoption, search about adoption, and one phrase that kept showing up was adoption certificate process. And I skipped over that a time or two, and then I went back and realized, you know, there actually isn't a document called an adoption certificate. So when I'm seeing people searching for adoption certificate process, I'm not 100% sure what they're looking for, but it doesn't exist.
Yeah, that is a funny one to find that that comes up as something that people are searching. And it does sound official,
It
right? It
does.
sounds like it
Yes.
could totally be a thing. And if I was
Right.
imagining what's involved in the adoption process and the paperwork, I would assume that's a thing. But actually, there's no such thing.
Right. And I think it reinforced the point, something we've talked about previously, that there are so many steps involved. If you've been through adoption, if you're in the midst of adoption, you understand that there are a lot of legal steps. There are a lot of forms. And it can all feel confusing because there is so much paperwork.
Right. Yeah. Actually, recently I was talking with a hopeful adoptive mom just getting ready to start her process. And she shared that understanding adoption terminology was the first thing she realized she needed to grasp because when she started looking into adoption and she was figuring out what's she looking for in an adoption, what agency is going to be the best fit, what are her first steps, and just trying to understand the overall adoption process, she said it was really confusing and she realized it's because there's so much terminology to try to grasp first. And
Right.
that makes total sense. And Heather, when people are searching for the adoption certificate process, I imagine that what they're thinking of actually exists. It's just not called that. And usually they're thinking of one of three things,
Hmm.
which there are three big documents in adoption.
Right. They're probably thinking of the amended birth certificate that is issued after the adoption, or they might be looking for the final decree of adoption. And, I think that it might even be as people are researching or looking for adoption records later in life.
Mhm.
So, I just thought it might be a good idea to talk about these three things, um, because people are looking for something. Like I say, adoption certificate is definitely a popular search term.
Right. And so let's start with the first one, Heather, because this one is probably the most common thing that adoptive parents and even adoptees who are searching for their own records, it's usually one of the first things that they're thinking of.
Right. And that would be the birth certificate issued after the adoption. Now, it's good to know that, whenever someone is born, usually in the hospital, one of the documents that the mother, the person who literally birthed the baby, fills out is the original birth certificate. And, whether you're an adoptive mom or not, any biological mother is usually presented with that to fill out the information on there, and then it's filed with the county. So when we're talking about a birth certificate after adoption, that's talking about an amended birth certificate. And that is what the state or county eventually issues in an adoption.
Hmm. And before you can get your birth certificate, the amended birth certificate, the adoption finalization needs to first take place because Heather, as you were describing that scene where a mother has just given birth, the hospital administrator comes around and has her fill out
Mhm.
the form for the birth certificate and sign the birth certificate, and all of that is filed locally with the government official records, right? Well, the adoption process hasn't taken place yet.
Right.
So, as adoptive parents, they don't ask you to fill out a birth certificate just yet. A few extra steps need a few More steps need to take place before you will then complete your form for the birth certificate with your names as mom and dad and the
Mhm,
name that you've given your child. That's actually a frequently asked question.
mhm.
Um, it's pretty common to just think about the adoption process itself, but then there are these little details like how does it happen that the child gets our name? And if the birth mom is the one filling out the birth certificate at the hospital, then where in that process it's like double dutch, like where do we get in? When do
Right.
we get to put our names in? Is it always going to be like that, a different name when, forever as we parent the child? But actually, a little known fact is that adoptees have two birth certificates.
That's right.
Hmm.
And once there is that amended birth certificate that shows the adoptive parents' names, that becomes the child's legal birth certificate, legal birth record moving forward. And that's often surprising because people may assume that they need the original birth certificate, or they may think that the original birth certificate just gets changed or edited, but that is definitely not how it works. Like Kim mentioned, when the adoption is finalized, that is when a new birth certificate is issued that reflects the adoptive family.
Hmm. And Heather, we recently did an episode all about adoption timelines, which I think that's a good listen if you're new to the process, trying to understand, well, when does finalization happen? What are the steps? Go and listen to that podcast episode about adoption timelines, and it'll help map it out for you in your mind. And when adoptive parents think about the adoption certificate, yeah, I think they're usually talking about the amended birth certificate.
Mhm. Right. So after your adoption is finalized in court, and that's what Kim's talking about in timelines. So the adoption is finalized and you don't get your birth certificate, your amended birth certificate that day. The court then sends the paperwork to the state or county vital records office, and then they process the paperwork and issue the amended birth certificate. And once that happens, once that's done, then what adoptive parents can do is they can request certified copies, the stamped ones, just like any other birth certificate or any other record you get from the records of vital records, Office of Vital Records.
Yes, so that's then what you're going to use. That's the birth certificate you're
Mhm.
going to use when you enroll your child in school. You go to get a passport, you start to establish things with a pediatrician, you need medical records, all the normal situations when a birth certificate is usually required. That's the birth certificate you will use as adoptive parents once you have obtained it, once you have finalized
Right.
your adoption.
And it's good to know that timing will vary depending on the state. Sometimes families can get that pretty quickly. Other times it can take longer than you wish for the state to process the paperwork, create and issue that amended birth certificate.
And the second thing that people may be referring to as an adoption certificate is the adoption decree.
Right. That is something else that you get at finalization. When the adoption is completed in court, that's when the judge will issue, it's really called a final decree of adoption.
Mhm. And this is what officially establishes your role as parents and that child as your child under the law, that you are the only mom and dad who have legal rights to this child because now the adoption is finalized and you have the final decree of adoption, an actual piece of paperwork showing you are the parents.
Right. And that's the moment that the adoption is legally complete. We've talked in the past about for many families that finalization day, that hearing can be a special day. Sometimes families invite relatives, sometimes they take pictures. It can be a real celebration because it is the official, I'm going to say ending of the adoption process. Um, but but legally speaking, you know, what's happening in the moment is the judge is signing that adoption decree.
Hmm. And I love, Heather, families that we assist, they often send us
Hmm.
photos of that day. And we recently received a photo of a family that had their finalization hearing. And then they all went out to lunch after.
Mhm.
And it was like this long, I think they were, the table that they had to put together was as long as the whole restaurant. But it was like maybe they had a bunch of cousins and siblings, and many of them had little ones too at the
Mhm.
table. And it was just such a celebration. And it's a little off topic, but I think that is part of what birth moms are visualizing for their child, that support network. And
Mhm.
often your village will show up as part of that celebration on that finalization day. And whether you have a court date and everyone's able to be there in person with you, or you set a date to celebrate maybe that Sunday after church or something, and then you all meet up at wherever it is that you meet up that has enough
Mhm.
room for you. It is just such an important moment, but definitely that is an important document that I think adoptive parents are just wondering when they're going to get their hands on that.
Right. Right. So good to keep in mind, amended birth certificate was the first thing. This
Hmm.
is the decree of adoption. And really it is the legal document that finalizes the adoption, but the birth certificate, that is your identity document. That is the one that verifies, you know, just who you are, just as anyone's birth certificate does. That is the identity document moving forward. But the adoption decree, like I say, it's the nice legal document that finalizes that adoption.
And actually, that comes before the birth certificate, right? The amended birth
Yes.
certificate. So you need that not only to get the birth certificate, but in the meantime,
Hmm.
because you need,
You might need it.
paperwork.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might need it for like, being able to make medical decisions and things like that, and just to show that you are going to be putting this child on your insurance and you don't want to wait all those extra weeks and months.
Hmm. Right. So then the only other thing I could think of for adoption certificate process is if adult adoptees are searching for records.
Right. And so in those situations, an adoptee might be trying to obtain their original birth certificate or any other adoption records that exist. And when I fielded calls like this on our adoption help hotline, often adoptees do Google how to learn about adoption, how to find my
Hmm.
birth parents, how to get my records, how to get my adoption certificate, and it lands on our hotline, our adoption help answer line, so to speak. So I'm one of those people that can answer that, and usually they are people who were adopted through the foster system or from an era where when adoption wasn't openly discussed and maybe they didn't find out until later that they were adopted. So, nowadays in adoption, adoptive parents are more likely to just have full disclosure and transparency over the whole
Right.
adoption event itself. And, the child receives their original birth certificate, their amended birth certificate, their decree. These are just like part of their documents growing up.
Hmm.
If you're a parent, you have a file that has all your child's documents in it, and maybe that becomes the file where you keep all their report cards if you have printouts of that. But adoptees are often wondering how to get that, how to get their original birth certificate and or any other records that they're imagining exist.
Right.
And
And that's, that can be complicated because laws around adoption records, first off, they vary widely from state to state, from county to county, from agency to agency. There is no one place that stores adoption records because they are kind of judicial in nature. It may be how each court stored them. And then, you can often easily or more easily get your amended birth certificate than the original birth certificate. So, and the reason I mention the laws too is because sometimes states allow adoptees, adult adoptees, to request that original birth certificate once they're adults. Other states may not. But even if you have the legal ability to request those, it can still be very, very difficult, especially depending on, I'm going to say, depending on your age. If you were born in the 60s, 50s, 70s. These are before computers were a normal thing. So a lot of those records are not computerized.
Mm.
And they may still exist somewhere, but we've worked with people who can't get their records because there was a fire in the courthouse and everything burned down, or people don't know where to go and look for these paper records from 1957. There's just such a wide variety of laws, of storage options, of procedures. And sometimes it need to get court orders. You need to get court petitions. You may need to work with intermediaries, and still it can be a challenge.
Hmm. As I'm listening to you talk, Heather, it starts to make sense to me why there should be some privacy and a process, maybe even a petition to request that, and why someone might need to be an adult first.
Mhm,
Because your original birth certificate doesn't involve just you, the child who was adopted or who was born. It also may have the name of, it will have the name of your birth mother on there, and she might have wanted that to be private for a reason. And so when you are accessing that, it is going to reveal her identity and, perhaps allow a path to locating her and learning more about her. And so I can see why there could be privacy things in place depending on the nature of those circumstances that led her to having a baby that was going to be placed for adoption. Um, and I think that when adoptees are looking for their adoption certificate, it might really mean that they are just looking for any historical records
mhm,
related to their adoption. And I love that you made it a point to say that it could be a little bit difficult. And I hope that we're helping listeners understand why that could be, especially because in decades past, adoption was seen so differently. And we've talked about that a bit on our past podcast. But nowadays, more birth moms are very open about their adoption plan and
mhm,
they want their child to know exactly who they are, and the adoptive parents want that. And everyone knows that, especially when a birth mother has chosen to make an adoption plan for a child, that it is typically in the best interest of a child
mhm.
to know exactly who the birth mom is all along. But in decades past, it just wasn't like that.
No, no. And
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this today, because I think I think probably by and large these searches may be by adult adoptees who really, they're not involved in an active adoption process. They're living as now adults who were, part of the adoption triad. They were in many cases the purpose of the adoption. But if especially if it was closed adoption, they're not going to be educated on the proper terminology. I mean, why would they be? And it's not that it's proper or improper, I guess. It's just more about what these documents are called, so that maybe when you are searching for your adoption certificate, whatever it is, maybe you learn a little more so you are able to request the document you're looking for.
Which would be your original birth certificate or your adoption finalization decree.
Hmm.
Because if someone calls and says, I'm looking for my adoption records, what I think is they want the case notes from the social worker or the coordinator that helped with that adoption and was writing down conversationally what took place between the agency and the birth mom. That's what I think, because that's the record I'm thinking of,
Hmm.
unless they specifically say, I'm looking for my original birth certificate.
Hmm.
Right? So, yeah, and I think it's so good that we're having this conversation not only to just spell out very clearly what to look for, what to expect, and what the terminology is, and adoption certificate isn't a thing, but there's just so much meaning to each of these moments where
Hmm.
these documents come to exist, or there's a story behind the original birth certificate an
Hmm.
adult adoptee may be looking for. And so even though these are just admin things and legal documents, these are so meaningful in the life of adoptive parents in the life of the adoptee, and especially an adult adoptee who really may be just looking for any trace of their own history.
Right. And I think that's something that's good to touch on too, because like you mentioned, Kim, you mentioned case notes. Case notes are not filed as part of an adoption
Mm-mm.
finalization. So if you are an adult adoptee looking for your adoption records, you know, what you may find is forms that are completed, forms that are filled out. Well, I know I've spoken with adoptees who were hoping to find answers to all the questions, and sometimes they do. Sometimes they get answers to half of the questions. Sometimes there's not answers to any of the questions. So that's one of those things that's just good to know and understand if you're looking for your adoption records. Um, I would always, I mean, a great tip is, ask for anything you can get. Ask for any records that pertain to your adoption because you don't know first off legally what you're allowed to ask for in the jurisdiction of your adoption, and you don't know what's going to be there. Again, as I said, especially if you are, were adopted prior to computerized records. So yeah, it really just is kind of, I think, good to understand um, and not be you know, I have this image of someone going into a county office and asking for their adoption certificate and encountering people who are like, "Yeah, we don't know what you're asking for." And that's
Hmm.
kind of, I think, where I was coming from today, because people don't know. They ask for what they think it is. And just learning a little more about what each of these documents are might help you when you're going to ask because you can be a little more confident and also maybe the people who are trying to help you can be a little more helpful when they know specifically what you're looking for.
Yes. So if you're listening to this and you ever hear someone mention the adoption certificate process or wanting to get their adoption certificate, then now you can help them understand and learn that what they're usually talking about is one of these three things.
Right? That amended birth certificate after the adoption, the final decree of adoption from the court, that's the name of it, final decree of adoption, or they may simply just be looking for their adoption records later in life.
Yes, and I love that we're doing an episode on this because understanding the difference between those documents can make the process feel a lot clearer, not just for adoptees, but especially for adoptive parents too that are just trying to get their bearings and navigate
Right.
everything.
And I think too, I'm glad you mentioned adoptive parents because sometimes parents don't understand that, once they have the child, the documents don't come with the baby. Here's your baby, here's
Yeah.
your documents. You know,
It was like FAO Schwartz. You could go and you can like tell the toy store, right? FAO
yes,
Schwartz. They
yes.
had a hospital experience where you could go and design a doll or pick out the characteristics and
Or
you'd
build a bear.
or build a bear. Yeah, and you would receive your build a bear or your baby doll into your
Mhm.
arms and it comes with the paperwork instantly.
Yes.
And I think even though that's just such a childlike experience, it kind of stays programmed in our brains. So maybe
Mhm.
that's what people are kind of thinking is going to happen, but it is a process. Welcome to adulting. Everything is is a process.
And it does. Adoption involves paperwork, it involves legal steps, it involves, you know, getting on court calendars. But, that's the paperwork aspect. We
Mhm.
know it is truly about relationships. It's about those lifelong connections, but the paperwork and the forms are still important.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please be sure to subscribe to Let's Talk Adoption so you never miss an episode.
And if there's a question about adoption you're thinking about, or you have any suggestions for future episodes, please visit us at letstalkadoption.com. We would love to hear your thoughts and ideas, and we love answering your questions.
Well, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on Let's Talk Adoption.